Party faithful couldn't have been more effusive when Margaret Thatcher celebrated 10 years as Prime Minister. But just 13 months later, the woman who'd won 3 elections for the Conservatives was deposed. Why did so many senior Tories turn against her?
I think and thought at the time that Margaret Thatcher stayed on too long. I supported her right to the end, and I thought she would prevail right at the end. But I wished in myself, and I think many other people did too, many of her friends did too, that she'd actually gone a little bit earlier, say a year or so earlier, after the 87 victory. People ran out of patience, really, out of support with her particular style of doing things.
She was seen as increasingly out of touch. Even her grammar became monarchical.
We have become a grandmother of a grandson called Michael.
Towards the end of her time, her courage didn't desert her, but her political instincts did.
In what way?
She became reckless.
Tensions between a Prime Minister and Chancellor are now almost part of the British Constitution. But the arguments between Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson were the beginning of her downfall. The controversial new poll tax was an enormous point of difference between them. There were also fierce rows over Europe. But the final straw came when Mrs. Thatcher backed her number 10 economics advisor over her Chancellor. On the 26th of October 1989, Nigel Lawson resigned.
You considering another rise in interest rates, Mr. Lawson?
To lose a Chancellor may be misfortune, but to lose a Deputy Prime Minister as well looks like carelessness.
Thank you. Lean forward slightly as well.
Can you just stand there?
Thank you, madam.
My relationship with Margaret Thatcher lasted 15 years, starting in 1975 and ending in 1990. And that's longer than most marriages last, and probably it was at its best at the beginning. My manner of argument is one of tenacious repetition, if you like. I don't like shouting at people, whereas I was shouted at to some extent. I think that can be quite irritating if you're a quiet, consistent badger. That doesn't always please the person who prefers badger baiting.
Demoted from the post of Foreign Secretary, Howe was increasingly sidelined, not even told about the decision finally to join the ERM in October 1990.
I wasn't consulted about it, although I was Deputy Prime Minister. I heard about it from the Queen, rather embarrassingly. So I was kept at arm's length, and that was an uncomfortable position. It wasn't good for the government, or for her, or for me.
The badger was then baited beyond endurance by this rejection of proposals from Brussels.
No, no, no.
The Prime Minister realised she would be facing a leadership challenge. At her most regal, she threw down the gauntlet.
I'm still at the crease, though the bowling's been pretty hostile of late. And in case anyone doubted it, can I assure you there will be no ducking the bouncers, no stonewalling, no playing for time.
She wasn't prepared for this googly from her once loyal deputy.
It's rather like sending your opening batsman to the crease, only for them to find, the moment the first balls are bowled, that their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain.
One minister said it was like a battered wife finally turning on a violent husband.
The time has come for others to consider their own response to the tragic conflict of loyalties with which I have myself wrestled for perhaps too long.
He clearly meant Michael Heseltine.
She was shaken. she couldn't believe that Geoffrey would make that speech. If you ever see the film of that, her face during that speech, she sat there expecting to hear the normal speech of a sort of minister who's resigned making a personal statement. And during the course of it, you can see she was deeply wounded. And it was the beginning of the end, quite frankly. And I happened to see Michael Heseltine that night, and he said to me, she's finished. After Geoffrey's speech today, she's finished. And there's no doubt at all that that convinced Michael that he should challenge her.
Instead of staying home to canvass support, Mrs. Thatcher went to a summit of world leaders in Paris. She was at the British Embassy when the result of the first ballot came through.
We went to Paris, and the news came on the second evening, I think, of the first ballot, where she'd beaten Michael Heseltine, but not by a margin which prevented a second ballot. And it was actually bad news.
Mrs. Thatcher, could I ask you to comment?
Good evening. Good evening.
Where's the microphone? It's here. This is the microphone.
Naturally very pleased that I got more than half the parliamentary party, and disappointed that it's not quite enough to win on the first ballot. So I confirm it is my intention to let my name go forward for the second ballot.
We were due at a huge banquet at Versailles, and we sent a message to President Mitterrand saying the Prime Minister's got things she's got to do, she'll be a bit late, please start. When we eventually got there, which was, I think, well after 10 o'clock, they had not started. Out of courtesy, Mitterrand had held everything. She looked superb, and they all were amazed. It was the sort of buzz of the evening. And I actually felt, very proud for her and of her that night. It was a sort of a melancholy climax, really. I still thought she'd win.
In fact, she'd been fatally wounded by not winning outright, as those closest to her realised immediately. In public, she put on a brave face.
I fight on, I fight to win.
In private, Mrs. Thatcher decided to consult the cabinet one by one.
I'd already told her team that, in my opinion, she shouldn't stand. She was trying to get me to snap out of it and stop being so defeatist. And I was telling her that I wasn't being defeatist, that she'd been defeated. And that if she didn't stand down, she'd be defeated on a grand scale if she went on to the second ballot, which I still think was perfectly sound advice.
The final cabinet meeting was a very emotional occasion. When one went into the room, unusually, she was already there. Normally she came down, the door was open, we followed her. But she was there, and a box of Kleenexes on her left. And she'd quite clearly been crying. She wasn't crying then. But the atmosphere was very tense, and she announced that she was going to resign. And she read her resignation statement out. And she sort of half broke down a couple of times. One or two people were in tears, a number of people were very moved. And she just cut it off and said, look, I much prefer business to sympathy. Let's get on with the cabinet agenda. So we got on. Somebody said, oh, we're going to pin regicide on Heseltine. And she looked a bit puzzled. What do you mean? Well, Michael Heseltine. And she said, no, she said, it wasn't Michael Heseltine. She said, it was the cabinet. And she was just stating a fact. She didn't say it in an acrimonious way, but that was a very shattering moment, and a lot of people looked very embarrassed, as well they might.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years, and we're very happy that we leave the United Kingdom in a very, very much better state than when we came here 11 and a half years ago. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
She did find it a very embittering experience. I think it marked the rest of her life. I don't think she ever had a happy moment after she ceased being Prime Minister.